You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your pro-woman host, Abraham.
And I'm going to be your myth-busting host, Shane.
Nice. I like that one. Yes, I am not a woman, but I would like to be in support of women as much as is possible, given my status and everything in the world, being a cisgender, straight, white male in the prime of life.
Yeah. Yep.
Trying to leverage my privilege here. So anyway, we are following up our discussion this week from our discussion last week, where we are talking about abortion.
So as a quick recap of what we covered last week, we talked about kind of the history and definition and background of abortions. We talked about Roe v. Wade and kind of what the implications of that were. And then we talked about the different types of medical abortions that do exist and those procedures that are out there. So that's what we have primed you for. And in this episode, we're going to talk about reasons why. We're going to talk about the psychological impact, and we're going to kind of undo some conspiracy theories and some myths about abortion and what kind of happens with that stuff.
I do strongly recommend that if you did not listen to the first part, that you go back and check that out. And if you are joining us for the first time, we're a psychology podcast. We kind of get to talk about all things human behavior related. And well, this is one of those.
Yep.
Sometimes we keep it really light. Sometimes we get really heavy. And I'm not sure eager is the right word, but I am optimistic that we can do justice to this topic. And I feel like I was proud of how we handled the first episode. So I'm looking forward to being able to wrap this up and sort of put a bow on it.
I think ultimately, too, going along with our values, if you have anything that you want to add, anything that you would like to share, anything that you would like to contribute to this discussion, we would be happy to hear it, as long as it is not you just telling us that we're going to burn in hell or something along those lines. Like, we want this to be like a productive discussion. I mean, you can tell us that we're going to burn in hell. We'll probably ignore those emails. But if you do say something like, you do want to have a discussion about this, we're happy to continue that discussion.
All right, well, let's, without further sort of preamble here, get into the topic, because the first thing we need to discuss is understanding the reasons that women get abortions. Because I think that there's some misconceptions here, but it does really deserve its own sort of center stage airtime.
Absolutely. So it's a fairly common argument that a lot of people will get abortions as a form of birth control. I hear that argument all the time. I don't know if you've ever heard that, where people will be like, I'm all for abortions, but just not as a form of birth control. It's like, do you think that that's really what's going on? Like, you think people, I mean, there may be somebody who does that, but that's also their choice, so who cares?
Fair point.
But have you ever heard that argument?
Oh, for sure. And it's almost like, to be clear what we mean by a form of birth control, meaning that like it was just an accident and I didn't want it, so I'm just going to react to the situation by having it go away.
Right.
And that's just not the case for most people.
Yeah, there are quite a few reasons why someone might decide to terminate a pregnancy. So according to Che et al. In 2017, data from 14 countries suggests that the most common reason someone would decide to have an abortion would be for socioeconomic reasons. So that is the primary reason why somebody might have an abortion, is due to socioeconomic status.
Yeah, in that study, they shared additional data that showed that the availability of contraceptive resources, and showed that nearly every country had less than 30% prevalence in terms of access to those contraceptives. These data also shared income classifications and saw no difference for socioeconomic reasons across higher and lower income ranked countries, essentially meaning that people from every level of wealth have historically gotten abortions.
Yep, absolutely. And they included a lot of really interesting discussions about this. So there were some additional reasons that were in the article that were not related to socioeconomic status. There were issues of interfering with future opportunities. Some were partner related. The partner was not a good fit. They weren't with that partner, or that partner was abusive or dangerous. A risk to their health, which we talked about in the previous episode, that, risk to health might result in the need for a medical abortion.
Right.
Need to focus on other children. Maybe they have so many children that they need to focus, or they need to prioritize, and that's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
They're not emotionally or mentally prepared. And I really like that as a reason. That's a very mature thing to say. It's like, I'm not capable of handling a child.
Right.
Like, what kind of life would this child have in my care when I know that I'm not ready to handle a child? We talked about influences from family. Sometimes families will influence somebody to get an abortion when they don't want to.
Yeah.
That's not common, but that does happen. And they don't want to place the baby up for adoption. And we'll talk about that, the foster care system and adoption as well. And those are different reasons why women might have abortions in different scenarios.
Yes. Now, specifically, as you mentioned, the partner-related abortions. Mm-hmm. Now, some women note that pregnancies as a result of rape, domestic abuse, or incest are common reasons for terminating a pregnancy. And just like take a moment to think about this. We have a lot of female listeners, but we also have a decent amount of male listeners as well. Of like, if someone forced themselves on a person against their will that resulted in a pregnancy in and of itself is a pretty challenge. I mean, obviously I've never had one. I'm never going to have a pregnancy, so I can't, but it's a lot to ask to say, well, you should just have to carry it through. Like, too bad for you. Or like when in those cases of incest, usually also cases of sexual assault and rape that could pose a lot of health risks to the baby, to the mother. I think it's very problematic to demand, nope, you have to go through this pregnancy. You have to go through with having this child. You have to then take care of this child, despite the fact that it was born out of this situation. Mm-hmm. That's a really big ask.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as we have already debunked in the previous episode, it is not God's will because God doesn't mention that in the Bible. So that argument can get thrown out the window as well.
Also, the majority of pregnancies are terminated in the first few weeks anyway. It's like 70%. So God has a hand in terminating pregnancies at a level that we've never achieved as a society.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
So someone once said that God is the most prolific abortionist of all, given how many pregnancies end for no apparent reason.
Yep, exactly. So now I do want to share, this is an anecdotal story. So like, and we do understand this is not the common case for everybody, but it's important to hear stories about people who have chosen to have abortions due to health reasons. You know, when we talk about those health related topics, they impact both the mother and the child. And some stories include Dr. Erica Goldblatt Hyatt. She decided to terminate her pregnancy because her child had a rare condition called congenital high airway obstruction syndrome. And so what does this mean? This means that his trachea did not form due to chromosomal abnormality. Had she not had a miscarriage, her child would have been born brain dead. And it was deemed that the fetus had too severe a case to address with surgery post-birth, so she decided to terminate. So she ended up having an abortion as a result of this because there were so many other factors that were included in here. The baby would have been born brain dead. It posed specific health risks to her to carry until term. And even after birth, they could have done surgery and it wouldn't have helped this kid.
And as far as we know, she wanted to have a baby. It just like it worked out such that like she really wasn't going to get to have that experience. Not really.
Right.
And her story isn't the only one that includes this difficult decision in the situations. And it certainly won't be the last. There's genetic disorders, chromosomal abnormalities, and other rare medical conditions that all lead to decisions about reproductive health. And we're not talking about most of the time they're like, oh, they're going to be deaf or, oh, they're going to be blind. Like we understand that for most babies, like, first of all, you wouldn't be able to test for that very easily in the womb, as far as I know. And second, like we have a lot of supports for people who are in the deaf and blind community, for which I don't know if anybody ever in like modern history has ever cited that as a reason. It's more these situations where it's like, this is medically complicated. One or both may not survive. One of them may just live a life in a coma and never open their eyes. That sort of thing.
And I think that's an important distinction. Like, we're not talking about eugenics here. We're not talking about like, oh, right, you're unhappy with your fetus's like genetic makeup, so just get rid of it. What we're saying is like, in this situation, like this was a health risk for everybody involved. This baby, or this fetus, had it been born, would not have made it. It would have died. And so like they already knew the outcome well before. So like they made the decision early. They got ahead of it before it became a bigger issue.
And so a law that would force her to go through the pregnancy would mean she would have to give birth to this brain dead child. It would die pretty much immediately, or, you know, maybe survive a little while and then die fairly quickly soon after, or just not have to put her body through that process for something that was not viable in the first place. But yeah, that would remove her agency there. It'd remove the situation where she gets to make some decisions about how she would like her life to go. Like forcing someone to have a baby seems absolutely asinine to me.
Well, it just seems inhumane.
Yes.
It seems inhumane for everybody involved, especially given the current systems that are in place to help support babies after they're born. So, but we'll get into all that later too. Now, one commonly cited reason for deciding to have an abortion is the issue of ectopic pregnancies.
This is a big one.
This comes up all the time.
Yeah.
An ectopic pregnancy occurs when a fertilized egg implants and begins to grow outside of the main cavity of the uterus. Most often this occurs in the fallopian tube. And it's called a tubal pregnancy. And this can occur also on the ovaries, in the abdominal cavity, or on the cervix. So I want you to think about this for a second. Just like here, we're going to go back to biology 101. We're going to go back to your sex ed class, but an actual sex ed class, not the one that just says don't have sex. Right. So when an egg is fertilized, it attaches to the interior lining of the uterus. Once it attaches, it starts to develop. The placenta develops as like a means for like helping the fetus get nutrients and all that. And so it's supposed to attach on the inside, where that's what the uterus is designed to do. It's not designed to attach to the fallopian tubes, which
Right.
are not designed to cater the growth of a child.
Yeah. And there's not space for it either.
There's not space for it. So what ends up happening is a growing fetus in a fallopian tube will eventually rupture the fallopian tubes, cause internal bleeding, and really cause a whole lot of problems. So like they're really the only place that a baby can grow in a human body is inside a uterus without any sort of additional health risks.
Now, most abortion laws do not take into consideration the ectopic pregnancy as a potential reason for getting an abortion. And particularly in those laws that have deputized people to go after women who are getting an abortion, they're actually not at all interested in the reason. What they see is you're going to a place that provides abortions, therefore I'm going to sue you or I'm going to take you down or conduct a citizen's arrest or whatever.
Right.
But this reason is extremely important. Like the baby will definitely die. The mother will probably die if she's forced to go through with that. It is extremely, extremely dangerous. And it's completely unnecessary. And again, laws that prevent a woman from getting an abortion would prevent her from also getting treatment for this medical condition in which they are basically guaranteed a very, very painful death. Just to again, put this in perspective for the guys that are listeners out there who have a penis. It's just like, imagine that you had a thing growing in your urethra and it is going to grow to be the size of a watermelon. Mm-hmm. The space that is there is the space that you have, and how painful that would be. And the fact that, by the way, if this doesn't kill you, it is going to absolutely destroy you, and the thing will also die. And extreme, extreme pain. If you can imagine that urethra being stretched to the size of a child. Yeah. That is an unworkable situation.
Yeah. Y'all can barely handle a kidney stone. So get out of here with that.
Exactly.
You're absolutely right. And this is really kind of one of the main points about having flexible abortion laws and the right to choose, because in this situation, in ectopic pregnancies, there is no chance for that fetus to survive. When I say no chance, I mean no chance. The environment for which an ectopic pregnancy occurs cannot support the growth of a fetus.
Right.
It will not thrive. It will not grow. It literally cannot survive. And if the pregnancy continues without treatment, it can cause life-threatening internal bleeding and end up putting that mother's life at risk. And I think that you said it best. This is an unnecessary risk. We have the medical advancements to address this. It's unnecessary, and rigid anti-abortion laws are putting people at risk as a result of this. So it's important to know that these types of pregnancies are included in abortion bans.
Right. So we're going to take a breather, going to sit on that one and come back to talk about the psychological impact right after these messages from some sponsor. All right. So if you heard nothing, it was because either I forgot to insert an ad break in this episode, or the advertisers don't want to sell you anything. But probably there was an ad there, I think.
They heard that last bit and they went, oof.
Yeah, right.
Yeesh.
They saw the episode title and they're like, no ads on this episode.
No thanks on this one.
Yeah.
Let's take a second to talk about the psychological impact, because this is something that comes up a lot too. And I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding around kind of the outcome or the fallout of making a decision to have an abortion.
Right. Now, as we said in the first episode, and I want to make sure that this point is very clear, abortions are a medical procedure. They are. Mm-hmm. It is a medical consideration, it's a medical procedure. Now that we're oriented to that medical part of this, it is worth taking some time to discuss the psychological impacts of abortions on those who go through the experience of having an abortion.
Yeah, and the first article we're going to cite is Perezi and Batebi in 2011. And what they found in their study was that nearly 1/3 of women who have had an abortion report having psychological side effects afterwards. Now, it's 1/3 of women who have had abortions. Mm-hmm. Now, we're going to kind of talk about this later as well. Now, these concerns include depression, concerns about not being able to conceive again, abnormal eating behaviors, guilt, and nightmares. Now, we don't debunk this myth later, but I'm going to debunk it now. The way that abortion procedures work now is it's very likely that you will be able to conceive again. It's very rare that it will cause any sort of problems with being able to conceive again. That's not usually the thing that causes the problem. So it's one of those things that we kind of it's important to debunk as part of that.
Now, another article, Reardon 2018, dives further into this discussion to elevate what the literature actually says. And according to this article, there are some agreements, some disagreements, and some additional research opportunities. So let's start with, what are the agreements? First, abortion is associated with elevated mental health risks compared to those who have not had abortions. And hold on, before you jump on this, for some women, the abortion experience may directly relate to their mental health problems. So there are risk factors like pre-existing mental health conditions that produce a greater risk for women to have problems after an abortion. And it is impossible to conduct research in this field that can definitively identify the extent to which any mental health issues following an abortion can be attributed to the abortion itself, which is really important.
Yeah. So essentially what this article says is this. There are mental health outcomes that come along with this. They are not as common as a result of abortions because we just don't know, because you literally can't research that. What they have found is that women who have had pre-existing conditions who have had an abortion can have those pre-existing conditions exacerbated as a result of an abortion, but it's correlational. It's like you had depression before, you had abortion, you have more depression afterwards. Like it's all those types of psychological assessments and stuff like that you look at.
Right. Very important to have that like comparison. Otherwise, it's just sort of like you don't know what your snapshot actually includes or should include.
Yeah. So essentially, that's exactly what those agreements are, is that risk factors of pre-existing conditions can be made worse after an abortion. However, while there are some agreements, there are actually more disagreements. And the disagreements that Reardon talks about specifically is that the disagreements are very nuanced. The agreements are general agreements. Mental health concerns can be exacerbated, but it goes back to individual circumstance and unique circumstances for that person. Now, What they find is that the results of the studies are argued as generalizable when in fact they are not. And so that's one of his big gripes about the studies themselves, is essentially saying, people overgeneralize this. They say, if you have an abortion, you will be depressed. And that is just not the case.
Right.
You cannot take one study and generalize it to every single population or every single person that would, quote unquote, fit into that N or that subject, that inclusionary criterion. At the end of the day, it simply is not generalizable.
Well, and even if you take the numbers that they provided, it was 1/3, meaning that, 66% of people will not have that as an issue. And that's probably the 66% who did not have a mental health issue going into it in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. And while some researchers do agree that there are risks involved, there is no agreement on how the outcomes manifest. And that's another part of it too. It's like nobody really truly understands how they surface, like those different mental health concerns and all that, not in a really meaningful way. It's noted that each person who experiences an abortion has a complex combination of both positive and negative experiences, which I think is important to note too, that there are studies that demonstrate that there are positive outcomes for having an abortion as well that they don't talk about as much. Nobody will share that information because everybody's like, well, it's all negative. It's not really the case. Right. There are some good outcomes for folks as well. And so while some people have those negative outcomes manifest pretty quickly, others may have reactions that manifest over a lifetime. So there is no true way to study that in a really meaningful way.
Reardon also goes so far as to note that we cannot escape our own intrinsic biases on this topic. And specifically, they state, I've got a long quote here, so just bear with me. Mm-hmm. Our biases are not just personal. They also have a communal element. We tend to adopt the biases of our peers for several practical reasons. First, by adopting the opinion of our peers as our own, we are embracing a collective wisdom that frees us from the need to deeply research and consider every idea on our own. Second, the more completely our beliefs are aligned within our community of peers, the less we will face conflict and suspicion. Obviously, there is never perfect alignment or cessation of independent thinking, but the tendency to accept the quote-unquote conventional truths of one's peers as fact is a very real phenomenon, end quote.
I really love that quote because I think that goes into saying, like, there's so much languaging and so much kind of community acceptance of abortions are bad in the psychological community that stuff like this is like that. And that's why I actually really loved this article. I spent a lot of time with it because I was kind of like, this is like totally unpacking the myths around what people think and presume and assume about abortions. And he said, there are some effects, but we don't know the extent of those effects. And we can't accept blindly that there are always negative effects, which a lot of the research will demonstrate. So I really did enjoy this article. And I think this is, not to put one on a pedestal above another. I do think it's important to look at this as like a critical evaluation of the abortion research at this time.
Well, I really do appreciate their orientation to the fact that when we're trying to do these studies, we're evaluating what people report, that they are situated in a social context. And I mean, that's very clever thinking on their part to consider, like, what are the external variables that weigh in on us trying to conduct some analyses of these data. So that's great.
And I think there is a fine line between like being able to kind of like be critical about a particular phenomenon and then also be a conspiracy theorist. Like I think that like there is that line when they're in there when it's like talking about like that tendency to accept quote conventional truths. It's like, no, you should critically evaluate conventional truths, but you shouldn't go so far as to say like, well, abortions were brought to Earth by alien like lizard people because they didn't want as many humans, and so like they've tricked us into doing that. Like that's like a line that like I could see conspiracy theorists crossing, you know. Yeah. So I do think
I think you just started a cult.
Hey, listen, if it pays off my student loans, I may consider it. I do think it's important. I think it is important to know those social influences on the research that you conduct and how you have those conversations. And also, I mean, and this is going to be very armchair psychology on my part.
Fair.
Abortion is a highly emotional and personal topic.
Yeah.
And people are going to have emotional responses to the topic of abortions. Researchers and scientists and all those folks that are working with people who have had abortions, people who are anti-abortion when they're working in those spaces, you are exposed to emotional responses and forget that this is a medical thing.
Right.
And so I do think it is really important to kind of always go back and reorient to medical procedure, psychological outcomes, and figure out how to mesh those two and put those together in some kind of meaningful way.
And to that point, I mean, if we are going to conduct meaningful research in this area, then there are some serious obstacles that we need to overcome that are currently preventing further evaluation. One of them is access for abortion in relation to mental health, and another is concurrent positive and negative reactions. Mm-hmm. There's others as well.
And we kind of mentioned this before, like there's the issue with like an indeterminate time frame, like how quickly do these manifest, these responses manifest, the degrees of the reactions, going back to poorly defined terms, like that's always kind of an issue in research, right? Seriously. Like it's always an issue in research. And also multiple factors of causation. I mean, like just because somebody has depression or has like a predilection for depression does not mean that an abortion is the thing that triggered it, right? There could be several other unique factors that contribute to that. I mean, we saw a rise in mental health concerns during COVID.
Right.
And so you're going to tell me that like in, I don't know, let's say June of 2020, if somebody decided to have an abortion, are we attributing that increase in depression to abortion or COVID, or what other factors or causations are we looking at? Like it's simply too messy to say it's one single thing.
Yeah. And there are inherent preconceptions based on ideology and disproportionate exposure to different types of women and all of that. So again, there's a lack of ability to be in the perspective of what someone else is going through, and then feeling like you have some authority to make decisions about what their experience should or could be. And then also just thinking about the fact that like historically this research has been fairly gendered and sexist when men were the ones who are sort of conducting the studies and not necessarily, I think, weighing in the fact that like they're making a lot of assumptions. And so, yeah, we can do better.
Yeah, 100%.
There's another sort of, I don't know if this is a sidebar. This is pretty inherently related, but just another, I don't know if this is where this fits, but I just sort of decided to put it here, is the idea of people who are trying to have babies. Mm-hmm. And so there's fertility clinics and fertilization processes and something called, I think it's ART. It's like additional something for helping people get pregnant. And one of those methods that many people are aware of is in vitro fertilization. And in this process, just very briefly, essentially what they do is they take sperm and eggs, they combine them in such a way that they're likely to be able to be fertilized, and then deposit them into a host woman, carrier, someone who's trying to have a baby. And then assuming that worked, the combined cells will turn into a baby, right? That's sort of the short Cliff Notes version of that process. Is obviously much more complicated, and I'm missing a lot of nuance there. But point being that it is a fertilization process that involves combining a ton of eggs and a ton of sperm to try and make a little human for someone who wants to be a parent. Now, what's interesting about this process is that when you do that, you often have to freeze or hold on to those, or maybe someone runs out of money or they disappear or something like that. And right now, with Roe v. Wade being overturned, with some of the abortion laws that are going into states where they are not at all thinking critically about anything, they're writing laws in such a way that it would make it extremely difficult for fertilization and fertility clinics to continue to operate, because they'll make these embryos that they'll then have to freeze. And essentially, if those embryos are destroyed for any reason, they can technically be charged with abortion and have that be illegal. And so their job becomes a liability, even though they're trying to help women get pregnant. And there's like this, well, maybe they just have to store them indefinitely. I'm like, okay, how much freezer storage are we going to demand that these people take on when they're not financially set up to make that be possible, and just like store indefinitely because somebody died who was in the process, or somebody moved who was in the process, or somebody changed their mind, whatever happened. There's multiple reasons that they might not go through with it. And even if they do go through with it, you might have embryos that are accidentally destroyed, that are intentionally destroyed because they're like, well, you don't want 25 children. So let's go, that would kill you. So let's make it a reasonable number. Whatever the situation is, it makes it very difficult. And so they might actually end up shutting down fertility clinics, or at least making their jobs extremely difficult if they overturn this and write legislation in such a way that it does not consider that nuance. And I can think of almost no greater irony than the people who are trying to prevent abortion also preventing people from being able to have babies in the first place.
Yeah.
It seems counter to what they were mostly working for.
Right.
But like there are all these women then who, again, they've lost their choice even to have a baby. You know, there are people who they were going to get pregnant and now they can't because of you.
Right. I think you said it best. It's when people are not thinking critically. And it goes back to like, I'm going to introduce a new law. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to write some legislation right now.
Sweet.
I'm going to introduce a new law that whenever a legislator has to make a decision that includes something science-based, they should take a test. And if they don't pass it, they don't get to vote on it.
Yeah.
So if they don't understand it, if they can't write a paper and understand what an abortion is, or if they cite incorrect citations, or they do whatever it is, if they can't pass a paper on this thing, or they can't pass a test on it, they don't get to vote on it because it's ridiculous. It's absolutely non-critical thinking with theological backing and emotional responding in a situation that is actively harming people.
Right. Now, there was something, I don't know if we're going to get to this in the myth busting, but I just wanted to say really quick, because it occurred to me that we had talked about this outside of the recording and haven't mentioned it yet, which is, I was thinking about the ectopic pregnancies. There are also, I mean, people are familiar, I think, with the term stillbirth, right? Mm-hmm. Like there are babies who die in the womb and then they come out dead. Like they are no longer alive because they expired for one reason or another. This happens to women who are doing all the right things, but for some reason there was a genetic problem or some other issue that resulted in that fetus being terminated. And so again, like the trauma of carrying a pregnancy to term is already, whatever it is for people who are experiencing it, not easier than just like, taking a drink of water, right? So for some people it's going to be easier than others, but for those women who have a fetus that expires when they're pregnant, if abortion laws are changed, and this actually has happened. So this isn't even hypothetical. This isn't a slippery slope type argument. This is a thing that has already happened, is a baby died inside the womb and they could not get it removed. Mm-hmm. And so they're forced to carry around a corpse inside their body until it naturally passes, because they have no medical recourse. And while that is sitting in them, this rotting corpse can become toxic and septic and can lead to all kinds of medical problems and issues for the carrying mother. Mm-hmm. So the point being, like, this perspective taking piece of like, you stop making decisions for other people that like are their medical life and death decisions. And then you're making that choice for them, and one that's not informed, incidentally.
I want to think about this for a second. Like when you go into research and you have to like submit an application for an IRB or anything, one of the protected populations is pregnant women. Mm-hmm. And these anti-abortion laws are actively working against pregnant women. Like they are absolutely victimizing and aggressing toward pregnant women. But like there are research protections and humane research protections to prevent pregnant women from being exposed to standard research, right? Like there are like all these additional things you have to do on top of that. So I just think that like it's a shame that there are people making decisions for other people. I mean, and if this isn't the part where it's very clear about our stance on this, I don't know what is. But essentially these people who are anti-science should not be making choices for people who desperately need to make their own choices based on their unique circumstances.
Yeah. And I guess maybe to amend it, just say like, how would it feel? Maybe not like we should do it, but like, how would it feel? Like if you were in that situation, just, try and imagine that. I know some people are very bad at that sort of thing, but just try and consider like maybe your experience is not someone else's. So anyway, while you start sending anthrax and hate mail to us, we'll go ahead and give you a moment to do that and come right back after this break. Mm-hmm. All right, so I've been on some tirades. I think I should give the stage back to Shane, and let's do some myth busting.
Yeah, this is my favorite part of the show, and so I mean, we both love myth busting so much, but I do think it's fun to kind of like explore how people arrive at different conclusions, and then just tear it down.
Word.
The one that comes up a lot is the idea that the Bible forbids abortion, which we have already kind of established it's incorrect. I really want to kind of dig into this for a second. It's important to note that the Bible almost says nothing about abortion, or at least has nothing about anti-abortion sentiments. And I also want to kind of like point this out too. If you take one portion of the Bible literally and not all of it, then that's just cherry picking. And you're not supposed to be able to do that. You shouldn't be able to do that. Either it's all true or none of it's true. Either it's a written historical text or it's a book of parables. I like to think of it as a book of parables and fables that are like lesson stories. That's what it should be. And law should not be based on fictional stories. Right. And I'm not like, I want to be clear. I'm not just like for the sake of saying the Bible's fictional. I'm not doing that. What I'm saying is, like, if you were to create laws around like the Brothers Grimm, we would have very unique laws, right?
Fair.
So like maybe don't do that if you are using the Bible as like a vehicle to tell stories. Like maybe don't base laws on that where they're like moral stories.
Well, and also, I mean, then it makes sense to like, why don't we start creating laws that are based off of the Quran?
Yeah.
How about we do it based off of, Hinduism?
Yeah.
May as well. I mean, if you're making on the table that religion is an acceptable vehicle for making laws, then let's just look at all of them and start, passing all kinds of laws.
Right.
Obviously not something I would advocate, but that is kind of the logical next step.
Yeah. So I would make the argument that maybe we shouldn't do that for any historical book I think that we agree with that. And I think that we should base these laws on science. But, that's just a pro-science stance. What can I say?
All right. Myth number 2. Abortions are racist.
This one blew my mind when I was researching this. I was like, excuse me?
So have you never heard it before, or like just the argument? I
had never heard it until this I started doing the notes.
I'm not sure that I've heard it exactly this way, but I feel like I've heard something related to this. But this is useful for me as well.
Uh-huh.
Basically, the argument is that black children are an endangered species. Whoa. Yikes. Yeah. Not my words.
Yes.
And that if black women are able to have abortions, that they were being racist. Guess who founded this? Life As Always, a Texas anti-abortion group. They're the ones who came up with this idea. And they also compare abortion to slavery. So, those people.
Horrible.
They're the worst. And that is absolute nonsense.
To put this in perspective, I was working on the notes this morning to finalize that, and I read that this morning, and I had to take a break because I could not believe my eyes when I read that. Just to be clear, like, that's not like a made-up thing that somebody just posted a blog about. Like, they actually put up billboards and all this stuff. Like, in New York, they put up billboards in New York that said, like, oh, yeah, black kids are endangered. And you're like, I cannot for a second believe that that's a thing that happened. But, here we are. Texas back at it again.
Yeah, they're arguing that people who have dark skin are not the same species as people who have white skin.
Yeah.
Wow.
This is 2022, by the way. I want to make sure we're in this year. We're in the year of 2022. We're halfway through, and that's still a thing that comes up. So, you know,
I heard that recently, but someone was saying like, it's 2022. I can't believe this. I'm like, have you been paying attention though? Because like, I feel like 6 years ago, 5.5 years ago, we kind of were introduced to this is the world we're in. Now, like 7 years ago, I would have been like, yes, it is 2014. This is nonsense. Who would be saying this? But in 2022, I'm like, yeah, I guess that I understand that people are saying that because this is where we're at now.
Yeah. It's sad.
All right, let's do a real quick one on another myth. And this is the morning after pill, or also called Plan B. And this is one that, all right, so a lot of people look at Plan B and they're like, it's an abortion pill. The thing is, it doesn't work if the fetus is already been fertilized. It only works to prevent fertilization from occurring. And this is a normal medical healthcare procedure. Mm-hmm. It is simply a pill that someone takes to prevent the likelihood that they may have gotten pregnant. Oftentimes, they're not even sure if that was a possibility for them, but they're just trying to, again, sort of plan for their future. So this is before even the most ludicrous of arguments about conception could have even taken place. Literally nothing has happened yet.
Yeah.
It's like a retroactively applied condom.
Yeah.
Like, whoops, Control Z, undo.
It's essentially someone going, whoa, hold on a second.
Yeah.
That's what it is. That's you blocking traffic to be like, hey, there's a turtle in the road. Let's not run over the turtle. That's what that is.
Right.
It's stopping something from happening. That's all it is.
Turtle in the road is very relatable to many people, so that's good.
Yeah. We all stop for the turtle in the road.
Yeah. I think most states it's the deer on the road, but that's okay. Well,
okay, hold on. I forgot that turtles don't exist everywhere. So yeah, maybe deer in the road is fine. Ducks in the road, maybe ducks in the road. I don't know. Turtles in the road are like a thing that happens here all the time.
Yeah, and alligators and.
You know how many times I've been peed on by a turtle because I've saved it because I had to get it up out of the road and it started peeing on me? It's so many times.
They're scared.
They're so scared. Now, probably my favorite, and I just had this conversation with somebody, my favorite argument about why you should not go to different places to get abortion is because the people that are providing the abortions are just selling the fetuses.
To the highest bidder.
You've heard that, yeah?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, all right. So the argument is that the organizations like Planned Parenthood are paid per fetal part, and all of it is for profit, which is demonstrably false.
Right.
First of all, Planned Parenthood is incredibly underfunded.
Right.
And also, Planned Parenthood, that is a very small portion of the services they render.
Right.
Now, organizations like Planned Parenthood have the option to donate tissues after an abortion is completed. They have to get consent and stuff like that to doing stuff like that because it does require DNA and biohazard and stuff like that. But they receive a small reimbursement for their donation programs that are explicitly outlined in federal law. So there are very clear laws and rules for how that money is accepted, what it's for, where it goes. And the tissues often go to research, and the reimbursements are only used to recover costs, which is allowable per law.
Right.
There's not a doctor going like, well, I'll charge $400 and pocket $300. Like, they legally and literally cannot do that.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things like that that are big misconceptions. So no, they're not selling the fetuses so that people can go buy Ferraris. That's not what's happening.
And important, man, that would be so many fetuses. The important part of this is, I mean, I guess I don't know what the parts are going for, but it just seems like an absolutely ludicrous argument to be making. But yeah, I think another part of just real quick, sort of related to this, is the idea that the stem cells that are being used. And while I understand, like, people are like, oh, they're just having abortions so that they can use stem cells, like in South Park, to build another Shakey's pizza, because that's how stem cells work. Or a Steak and Shake, maybe. I don't remember which one it was. But anyway, most stem cells are not actually taken from fetuses anymore. Most of them are taken from others like skin cells and other things like that. Although there are still some for which that's the case. Again, it's more we happen to have this, so we should use the stem cells to help further medical research and, incidentally, fertilization research. They use those fetal stem cells to help guide research and helping develop fertilization so that people can get pregnant again. So halting or putting bans on that also slowed down the fertilization research. So again, you shot your other foot now. You're going to be hobbling quite badly.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's an important, I think, feature that is a lot of people are concerned about the stem cells part, but they're not actually using them. They're not using fetal stem cells very often. It's not the major part of it anymore.
Right. Or they're pulling them from, like, they're using placental cells, I think, too, or like umbilical cells. Like, so they're pulling them from other places.
Right. And what you can get from a live birth. Like,
yeah.
All right. As we talked about, I think it was in the last episode, we talked about these late term abortions. In states where it's legal, parents can have abortions without legal constraints all the way up to 40 weeks. This is essentially the argument that is being made. This is entirely misinterpreted. Can abortions happen late into a pregnancy? Yes, to an extent. But can everyone who is pregnant have an abortion in such late stages? Absolutely not. Abortions that happen that late in a pregnancy generally have medical clearance due to some type of health risk, as we mentioned, a stillborn, if the fetus has not survived, if there's a medical complication that means it's not going to survive or the mother's not going to survive. So there are several reasons why a late-term abortion might be necessary, but none of them are because I didn't want it. It's mostly because I don't want to die are the reasons that occurs. So, like, this is just not happening, at least not in any real way that people are arguing that it is. It's just a fear tactic. It's just like, I'm going to scare you into thinking that this is what's happening, even though it's not.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just goes to show the people that are making that argument, either they do understand abortion and they're using it as a fear tactic, or they just simply don't understand abortions and how they work or what they are. So, I mean, the arguments that I've seen, and I try to give people the benefit of the doubt, like, maybe you know, and maybe you are, like, smarter than you are. And then I see people making the argument, I'm like, nope, you just are ignorant. Like, you're just not that smart.
Well, consider yourself educated.
Yeah, there you go. Now, the one argument that comes up a lot, and you'll hear this a lot, is adoption is a viable option. So instead of having an abortion, why don't you just give up the baby for adoption? And one day we're going to give adoption and foster care the time it deserves,
right?
Because they are incredibly complex. There are many reasons why people adopt.
Yes,
it's definitely worth talking about. So we want to do that, but we want to share some basic stats on adoption and the foster care system where adoptions might come from, just so you can see how not so viable this option is. The first one is that no more than 2% of Americans have adopted.
It's a lot. I mean, there's a lot that haven't. I mean, it's given the need, that is a very, very, very small number.
Yeah. So speaking of needs, about 135,000 children are adopted each year, which sounds like a lot of kids, and good for them. I'm glad they did. But of these adoptions, 59% are from foster care systems. So that means 40% of those adoptions those kids are just not getting adopted. 26 are international adoptions, and 15 are voluntarily relinquished, which means that's what a lot of anti-abortion proponents are looking for. Like, you don't want to have your baby, give it up for adoption. So 15% of that 135 per year are getting adopted because they were voluntarily relinquished to the system.
Yeah, so they're making up a relatively small proportion of that right now, and everyone's basically arguing, well, just make it a much higher percentage. Anyway, on any given day, there are about 425,000 children in foster care. So we're looking at nearly 500,000 kids who are in the foster care system in the United States. Of these children, roughly 115,000 cannot be returned to their families either due to an absence of the family or family abuse, etc. And so they essentially just hang out in the foster care system until they age out a lot of the time, particularly if they were older when they entered it.
Yep.
Adoption rates do not match rates of children entering the foster care. Again, as we sort of already pointed out, there are a very small number of the children who are in the system who are actually being adopted, and so many are going into foster care. And that's after they've already had to suffer through the trauma that put them there in the first place. So it's just an important consideration. It's not so simple as like, we'll just throw them on the for sale shelf and someone will pick them up.
Well, and this is something we didn't really talk about too. With adoption laws and stuff like that, it is already incredibly difficult to adopt, let alone there are states that make it even more difficult for single parents to adopt, for single folks to adopt, for gay couples to adopt. So like you have limited the adoption pool already,
right,
on top of the fact that there are more than 3 times as many kids in the foster system than are getting adopted. So like it's just not happening.
Yeah.
Now add to that, you want to talk about racism for a second.
Do I?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. You seem like somebody who likes to talk about it. Most adoptions occur for non-Hispanic white children, accounting for about 73% of total adoptions, which means that if you are a person of color in the foster system, you are very unlikely to get adopted in that small margin that you already had.
Even though they are highly represented in the foster and adoption system, because, and there's some literature on this too, is that babies are taken away from people of darker skin at a much higher rate than they are of families with light skin, even when there are allegations of abuse. And sometimes they're taken away for very, very
minor infractions.
Very minor infractions. So there's like a ton of those kids who end up in the system and they just age out and they just aren't with their parents. And that's like just how that system has worked in many places. And so, yeah, just to be clear, of that 135,000 we mentioned of the children who adopted, 73% of those are non-Hispanic white children, even though they do not make up 73% of that pool. Like it is more evenly distributed across other races.
Yes.
Another thing here is about adoption is that the average age of adoption is 8 years old. And as I mentioned, as children get older, they're less and less likely to be adopted. Many children age out of the foster care system entirely without ever having been adopted. They just bounce from foster home to foster home. Sometimes they get lucky and they, get to stay in a home for that entire time, but they're never legally adopted. And I know we're not doing an adoption episode, but just so people know, there's a pretty big difference in legally adopted versus foster in terms of what your rights are as a parent. And fostering is very, very limited in what your rights are as a parent, whereas adoption means they are legally your child.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of considerations around just living in the foster care system for, indefinitely.
Another thing that I forgot to mention in here, but I think it's important, of that adoption pool, that 135 children that are adopted each year, that's not just from the foster care system. That's like a step parent adopting a child in a marriage where the child has not been separated from their family, right? Like those are the other types of adoptions that occur as part of that 135,000. So not even all of those adoptions are from foster care. So now the margin is even smaller, but I want to kind of, you brought up foster care and kind of that space. I want to talk about that for a second too. The current foster care system budget in the United States is around $4.3 billion per year.
That is less than Elon Musk proposed spending on Twitter.
Yes. So just for
food for
perspective,
thought.
And far less than the military budget.
Yes. Yeah. 1/11 of what he proposed spending on Twitter would entirely fund the foster care system, and for a much better cause than buying Twitter, of all things.
Yeah, of all things. Now, it costs about, they say, $6,675 per child per year to maintain the scant services that exist for them. It's not enough. It's never going to be enough.
Right.
The system itself, I mean, if you've ever worked in foster care, is hanging on by a thread. It is essentially an entire system that's duct taped together and hoping that we can get another year out of it. And unfortunately, a lot of these kids suffer the consequences of that. There are very few providers. Foster homes are often overcrowded. And that's not true for every single circumstance, but having worked in those spaces and watching those adoption processes that take 2, 3, 4, 5 years, it is arguably, like, for people who are arguing pro-life, it is one of the least humane arguments to look at because of the lack of resources and support in those spaces. And foster parents and people who are adopting, kudos to you. You're saints. When you can do it, you do it well, because it's not easy work. But it's unfortunate. It's not a system that it shouldn't be an option when rational, legal, and safe abortion is available.
Absolutely. We should take one more quick break to hear from our marketing overlords and then come back and finish up with some interesting tidbits and closing arguments, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so let's wrap up here by just sort of some other things to touch on with respect to this topic. And I understand, like, we did not do the deep dive that could have been done on this topic, but we wanted to unpack the sort of nuance and discussion that isn't being had in most of the circles where this is being talked about, and also bring in the sort of psychology and science of this, because it's a really important topic that's going to affect a lot of people if the current laws change, and it seems like they're very likely going to. So let's start with some other sort of interesting tidbits that are just food for thought.
One of my favorite tidbits, and I've heard this in the abortion argument a whole lot, and this is kind of more lighthearted, but Stevie Nicks of Fleetwood Mac has been famously quoted many, many times and stated that if she hadn't had an abortion, she's, quote, pretty sure there would have been no Fleetwood Mac, end quote. So basically she's saying, like, you know, I was able to go do this thing and do this creative pursuit and influence all these people, but if I hadn't had an abortion, there's no way that would have happened. And then we wouldn't have the chain.
Yeah, which is such a great song.
Yeah, exactly.
Wouldn't even know. Another interesting tidbit here is that various organizations that are not known for abortions have their own abortion stories sections. Doctors Without Borders shared a brief article sharing abortion stories from around the world, which is worth checking out. So if you want to learn more about that, again, it's not probably under the same banner, but it's out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we'll probably include that in the show notes. It's definitely in my reference list. So
cool. The one other thing I had is, and I was unable to dig up the reference for this, but I heard on it was a podcast of some sort recently, and I was, as I said, unable to fact check this. So I'm really curious if anybody has any further information about this and can highlight it. But what I heard was that essentially, very briefly, the distinction between contraception and abortion was not really very clear for a long time, because first of all, they didn't know how the process worked. And second of all, anything that ended the potential for pregnancy or prevented it from happening, or the birth, were all kind of part of the same spectrum of care. And what happened was the people who were performing abortions, particularly in the United States, who were mostly like doulas and midwives who were doing that, and we're doing them at home sometimes, or, you know, with the aid of some support. But the obstetricians, like the Society of Obstetricians or something, obstetrics, they basically turned this into a political issue where it wasn't before. Mm-hmm. Basically saying that we don't want these women doing these abortions because this is a medical procedure, it's in our field. Incidentally, they did make a lot of money for being the primary caregivers. And so by eliminating the midwives as competition, there was like a paycheck in it for them. Now, they came out as anti-abortion to try and demonize those midwives and doulas. And so, again, I need to check. I couldn't find the exact reference for this, so I apologize if any of it's incorrect. But that's just what I heard, is that this wasn't necessarily a political issue until this group of people made it a political issue for financial gain. And so we wouldn't necessarily even be having this conversation now, and might even have a specific amendment in the Constitution guaranteeing a right to medical autonomy for women if it hadn't been for that group of people.
Wild, huh? I mean, like, I feel like that happens all the time, where it's like, if you're encroaching on somebody's like funding source, they're gonna fight back and draw some lines, and then demonize people for in that space. So, which is a shame.
Right. All right. Take home points.
Yeah. I mean, I think my big take home points for these two episodes would be that abortion is a medical procedure.
Yep.
And it is a safe medical procedure, and one that, when somebody goes to and they decide to have an abortion, there are many, many reasons why. And their reasons are personal. They may have any number of reasons, and I don't think that should be governed. The choice shouldn't be governed. I think that medical procedures should be safe. I think that access should be safe. I think access should be reliable. And I do think, just at the end of the day, it's just important to know what an abortion actually is, and not the scary stories that people share when they're misinformed.
Yeah, exactly. And that sort of, my take home point, or one of them, dovetails nicely on that, I think, which is just that so many people think that this is just like, I don't really feel like having another kid, or I don't feel like having this baby, or something like that. One thing we didn't say in the myths is that the majority of people who get abortions are already parents. Mm-hmm. And they cannot support bringing another child into the world for one reason or another. But there are also people, again, the medical considerations that are just not being weighed as a factor in these conversations is extremely important. And that it's just, I like what you said, is it doesn't make sense to legislate this particular thing because there are so many nuanced pieces to it. And like, I'm fine if people want to like try and educate and say like, all right, like under the circumstances where this is just a choice and like there's other things that you could do, and they want to try and educate them non-aggressively and without lying to them and providing misinformation. I'm like, that's fine, you know, particularly if it's solicited. But as soon as it becomes aggressive, in your face, like scare tactics, lying, misinformation, and taking legislative action to prevent people from getting the medical care that they need, that becomes a huge problem. Yeah. And I'm absolutely going to be opposed to that. So, and just as another thing, I sort of waited on this, but like,
and another thing,
I know, right? Just as a thing, I am never going to know what it's like to carry a baby to term. I'm never going to know what it's like to have an abortion. I can't.
You clearly have never seen the movie Junior.
Oh, I have, but I not a medically sound movie. Premise, at least. And so I don't think that I should have a say in what a woman's choice would be in that situation. And even if I could, I still don't think it would be right for me to make that choice for other people, right? I think it's really inappropriate for me to be making those decisions about other people in that situation, aside from saying like, I'm going to back away from this. My support is with you. You do the thing that you've got to do.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's completely fair. Like, I don't think that I should have a say in that. I think another point that I would make is that a lot of the arguments against abortion right now, today, tend to be either conspiracy theoretical, right? They're selling that, which are all inherently based in like theological arguments, right? Which is interesting to me that the theological arguments against abortion are negated by the book that people often cite against it. When it comes to definitions of life, the definition of life comes back to, I believe they say in Genesis, right? When at first breath, which doesn't happen in the womb.
Fact.
The arguments against abortion, there's the Exodus and the Numbers scriptures that we talked about in the first episode that mention abortion, but don't have any sort of like capital punishment as a result of it because it's not a punishable crime.
Right.
So I think that when we start peeling apart the arguments, they start falling apart when you start bringing science into play and really looking at that. They tend to be moral arguments that almost are very difficult to win because people will kind of dig their heels into that and then base it on something a little bit less than earthly.
Yeah.
If you will.
Yes, I agree. I don't have any other take-home points. Do you have anything?
Support Planned Parenthood, support choice. And going back to our recommendations from the first episode, find out who is voting for what and vote them out if you don't agree with them.
Support women.
And support women.
Yep. Okay, great. Well, I hope we did okay. I hope that this was something where people who, again, like it is kind of weird for two straight white males
dudes,
to be talking about this. But like, I kind of also felt like I wanted to be on the side of like, there are people like us who are just trying to support women. Mm-hmm. And that from our perspective, like the things that impinge on their rights are inappropriate. I'm hoping that came through.
Well, and I think the other part of that too is like, yes, we have been the voice on these episodes for the last 2 episodes talking about this, where, you know, it is not an experience that we will have. So the other part of this is that we tend to use our platform to share voices when people do reach out to us. So please reach out to us. If you have thoughts, you want to share stories, we are happy to do a follow-up episode to talk about anything that we get from y'all. We are totally here to use this platform to talk about this in a really meaningful way. Yeah, reach out to us, info@wwd.podcast.com. You can also reach us on social media platforms and that sort of thing. Send us a message, send us a tweet or a whatever, slide into our DMs, as they say. Please do.
And just let us know. Tell us about your experiences with this. And you can also tell us about what you think about our recommendations. Shall we do some recommendations?
Let's do it.
Recommendations.
All right. So since we've covered 2 heavy episodes, we thought that we're going to go ahead and we're going to turn a little bit and we're going to do something a little bit lighthearted as a palate cleanser.
Yeah.
My recommendation is a video game that just came out recently. It's called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge.
Nice.
It harkens back so well to all of the wonderful, wonderful side-scrolling beat-em-up games that we used to play in the 90s as Ninja Turtles fans. So if you played like Turtles in Time or Hyperstone Heist or any of those games on Sega and all that, it looks exactly like that. It's not like the first Ninja Turtles game on NES, which was arguably one of the most difficult games on the planet. It is absolutely side-scrolling and like just totally a beat-em-up. Like you go through the streets, you go through the mall, you beat up the villain, da-da-da-da. And it's like a really fun, easy, you don't have to think about it too much. You just get to have fun with it. And you can play as, instead of the 4 Ninja Turtles, you can play as the 4, but you can also play as April, Splinter and Casey Jones. So you can play as additional characters, and there's a six-player co-op that you can play online and play with 6 people at the same time, which is wild. So
neat.
Yeah, it's fun.
And what platform is this on?
It's on everything right now, I think. I play it on Switch, but it's on everything at this point.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I am recommending just a treat. I'm recommending oat milk ice cream. Anytime that you want, whatever you're into. I've just found that of all the alternative milks, oat milk, I think, has just such a delightful texture in the ice cream. So if you are in the market for alternative milk-based ice creams, oat milk ice cream, and there's several brands that do this, but that one's one of my favorites. It's just very creamy, has sort of vaguely a nutty flavor and sometimes, but I don't know. It's very, very good. I enjoyed it a lot.
It is wonderful. I love oat milk.
Awesome. Thank you so much for listening. If you've made it through this all the way, and if you have comments, feel free to send them our way, of course. But also thank you to the people who support us on Patreon. If you want to support us on Patreon, you get access to early episodes, bonus episodes, behind the scenes stuff, videos, all kinds of things, and even episode notes, depending on what tier you sign up at or level for Patreon. You can also support us by leaving us a rating and a review. You can go to our merch store and pick up a mug or a water bottle or a jacket or anything like that, or shirt. We have some really cool shirts that Shane designed, actually.
Yeah.
They look nice.
They're fun.
Yeah. And of course, telling someone about us is another good one. And I think that's it for all the ways that you can support us. For those people who already are on Patreon, we always shout them out because they're amazing. And that's Amanda, Brad, The Daily BA, Joshua, Justin, Justine, Kim, Costia, Layla, Megan, Mike M, Mike T, Shauna, and Stephanie. Thank you all so much for your continued support and contributions.
Absolutely.
And then, of course, thank you so much for my team, Justin, Selena, Kyle, Alan, and thank you, Shane, for recording with me and all your notes on this topic today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was great.
All right. Anything that I missed before we wrap up?
No, I think that covers it. I think this was a lot to unpack, and hopefully you all learned something from it.
Indeed. All right. Well, thanks again. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.